Howdy, Bee Slayers. Welcome to another episode of the Migraine Miracle Moment. I've got a fun episode in store for you today, I think. I'm going to be doing a breakdown of a folk remedy that you might have heard about, especially if you spend any time on social media. And that remedy is the McDonald's migraine hack, as it's sometimes called. So what am I referring to? The McDonald's migraine hack is to drink a Coke and eat a large order of fries at the first sign of migraine. Now, if you've tried this hack before, you are not alone. It's been promoted by many people on social media, some of whom describe it as a lifesaver. On the other hand, there are those who say it makes things worse and should be avoided at all costs. And this is a very common scenario in the world of migraine, where one person's panacea is another person's poison. And in fact, in this case, the specific circumstances in which it's used is what determines the difference between whether it might help or whether it hurts. And I'll be covering those circumstances in this episode. Now, I should point out that this hack is a variation of a folk remedy that's been around in one way, shape, or form for quite a long time. Some of their versions of it include drinking coffee with some salt added, or drinking flat Coke with saltine crackers. So in this episode, I'm going to dig into the McDonald's migraine hack to help you decide if it's something you should have in your migraine toolkit. And this is actually kicking off a new kind of episode where I'll be doing this kind of thing regularly. I'll take a migraine treatment and dig into the science behind it to help you make better and more informed decisions, hopefully. And also to help keep you from getting taken advantage of by the folks out there who want to prey on and profit off of our desperation. Before I get to that, and since we'll be talking about remedies and their impact on migraine neurobiology, I wanted to let you know about a new quiz that is now available to help you assess your mitochondrial function. As you've heard me discuss in recent episodes, there is now considerable evidence that mitochondrial dysfunction is a root cause of migraine, meaning it's the driving factor in determining why some people get migraines and why others don't. So I've created a brief quiz that takes about 3 minutes to generate your mitochondrial function score and help you determine whether or not mitochondrial dysfunction might be playing a role in your migraines. And you can access that quiz by clicking the link in the description. Okay, now back to the topic at hand, the McDonald's migraine hack. As I said, I'll be doing more episodes like this where we'll break down a particular treatment that people advocate for migraine prevention or relief, in part to help you determine whether it's something to consider adding to your toolkit, but also in part to help you understand how to evaluate these sorts of things. And so I'll be using a framework for doing these analyses where we'll evaluate these interventions along several different dimensions. And there are really two broad questions we want to know here. The first is does this thing actually work, or what is the upside? And to answer that question, we want to know A, if there's any published scientific evidence for or against it, and B, if there is an effect, how strong is it? So how well does it work? So we want to know if it's effective, and if so, the strength of that effect. Now, in some cases, there will be little to no evidence. The therapy will have never been formally tested in a scientific trial. And in that case, the next question we ask is this something that's biologically plausible or not? So based on what we know about the treatment and about migraine physiology, is there a possible mechanism by which this could actually be helpful? For example, if somebody told you that holding a potato against your ear while standing on one leg was a migraine cure, you would be right to be skeptical since that wouldn't align with our current scientific understanding. All right, so again, first main question is, does it actually work, or what is the upside? Second question, what are the downsides? And with respect to the downsides, our main interest is in whether there are any known or potential risks, as well as the cost or expense of the treatment. Ultimately, the best kinds of treatments, the ones that we should strongly consider having in our toolkit, are the ones that have a lot of upside and little to no downside. So clear evidence of a strong effect, risk-free, and inexpensive. Those are the treatments that provide the best bang for the buck and that we don't want to miss out on. So with that framework in mind, let's look at the McDonald's migraine hack. First question in our framework, what does the scientific evidence say? Well, as you might imagine, this treatment hasn't ever been formally studied, so we don't have any published evidence to go on. However, we do have evidence that caffeine-containing abortive medications can sometimes help to alleviate a migraine. So combination pain relievers like Excedrin and Fioricet have caffeine in them, but overall, the scientific evidence is very limited. So the next best thing we can do is ask whether it's biologically plausible that this would work. And in this case, there are 3 plausible mechanisms by which this could help. One is the caffeine in the Coke, which I already mentioned. The second is the salt on the fries. So there is evidence that electrolyte imbalances, including low salt levels or sodium levels in particular, evidence that can contribute to triggering a migraine. And this is likely one reason why exercising on a hot day or just being out in the heat can provoke a migraine, especially if you rehydrate with just water and not any salt or electrolytes and develop what's known as dilutional hyponatremia. So in this case, the salt could be helpful in fixing that in this specific context. And then the third possible mechanism is that the rise in blood glucose from the Coke and the fries is helpful. And this is another mechanism that is plausible in a particular context. And that context is low blood sugar coupled with mitochondrial dysfunction. Many of you are probably familiar with the term hunger headaches, which refers to a headache that's triggered in the setting of hunger, which is typically stimulated by a drop in blood sugar. Incidentally, the hunger is more reflective of the speed of the drop in blood sugar rather than the actual amount. Now, if the mitochondria are functioning well, this should not provoke a hunger headache, as the mitochondria can easily shift to burning fatty acids for fuel when blood glucose drops. But if there is mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic inflexibility, then they aren't able to readily burn stored fat, which can lead to an energy mismatch in the brain and thus trigger a migraine under the energy crisis model. So again, the sudden surge in blood glucose can help restore blood sugar and potentially help prevent or avert a migraine in someone with mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic inflexibility. So, to summarize, there are biologically plausible mechanisms by which this hack could help to abort an attack in the right context. And there is plenty of anecdotal evidence that supports that idea, meaning lots of people out there who've done this and said that it helped. So those are the potential upsides. Now let's look at the potential downsides. So first, what are the risks? Well, the first risk is that it could actually worsen both the intensity and duration of the migraine. Again, if this is going to be helpful, it needs to be in one of those scenarios that I've described and needs to be taken at the right time, specifically early on when the migraine is just getting going. So it needs to be taken in that sweet spot to be effective. If it's not being taken in one of these scenarios where it could be helpful or outside of that window, then the surge in blood sugar is almost certainly going to prolong the intensity and duration of the migraine. So you're just giving the migraine more fuel. And then the other downside is that it will further worsen mitochondrial dysfunction by, number one, generating a big surge in reactive oxygen species because of the sugar. Number two, increasing inflammation because of the sugar and the seed oils that are used for frying the fries. And three, further aggravating metabolic inflexibility or the inability to switch between sugar and fat as a fuel source, which is a driving force in migraine in many people. And this is the vicious cycle that develops with hunger headaches, where metabolic inflexibility leads to headaches when blood sugar falls. And then the thing that you do in response to that, which is to grab a quick hit of sugar or easily digestible carbohydrate, makes that inflexibility worse. And so you end up perpetuating this vicious cycle. And then the final risk of this treatment is the caffeine itself. So yes, it can help to abort a migraine, but we also know that the caffeine-containing analgesics are one of the worst at promoting rebound headaches. A short-term fix, but one that leads to more migraines over the long term. As I mentioned, the other potential downside of an intervention in this framework is the cost. In this case, this remedy is very cheap, so it does have that going for it. All right, so what is the final verdict? Should you give the McDonald's migraine hack a try? Overall, the benefit to risk ratio isn't particularly great. It is certainly not a must-have in our toolkit. However, there are some specific circumstances where it could be useful, and the key is in knowing what those are. It's definitely not the sort of thing you'd want to do on any regular basis, and it's more something to keep in mind when you're in a pinch. Now, ideally, if you have a migraine that's been triggered by dehydration or low sodium, there are certainly alternative ways of dealing with that where the downsides are much less. Obviously, drinking Coke or a soda is about the worst way to deal with low blood sugar, so a much better alternative to this hack might be some well-salted white rice with a bit of honey, for example. So an easily digestible starch with salt and a little bit of sugar in a better format. So honey being preferable to table sugar. And the sugar does help you absorb the salt and water faster, so there's evidence for that effect. And of course, will also help to raise blood sugar if that is necessary. All right, so that's it. That's the breakdown of the McDonald's migraine hack. As I mentioned, I'll be doing these with other treatments you may have heard about, including others promoted on social media, focusing initially on drug-free ones. Number one, to separate the science from the hype and to help you identify things to potentially add to your toolkit, like I said, but also to help give you a framework for evaluating ones that you hear about. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast to ensure that you catch those future episodes if you want to hear them. Also, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to take a short 3-minute quiz to get your mitochondrial function score, you can click on the link in the podcast description to do that. All right, thanks so much for listening, and now it's time to go out and slay the beast.